Tēnā koutou katoa, in the words of a Māori a greeting. Uh, Hello, I'm Professor Robin Kearns, University of Auckland. I'm in the School of Environment at University of Auckland, another U of A, sending greetings to University of Alberta. Um, I want to talk today about sustaining cities and communities, especially focusing on the COVID world that we're living in and moving beyond that. So the Sustainable Development Goal number 11 explicitly says that we should try and make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So these are very large goals, and I can only begin to touch on these in the requested 17 minutes. It's sort of like a haiku poem in 17 syllables, I guess, a great discipline to try and be brief. But to give you a small taste of that, I thought to just begin with, let's just briefly reflect on the SDGs in general. It seems to be goals are aims or desired results, and what we're trying to do here with these goals is to think about ways of moving beyond the present, finding a new stage in a changing situation, but in a sense that can be maintained, that is, in the words of the goal, sustainable. So looking for a new way of thinking that is in fact something that can be maintained. So COVID-19 seems to me to add urgency to this goal because it has totally reconfigured the way we live our lives, at least for the time being. So let's come back to that a little later in this talk. But for the time being, just to highlight the aim, we're critically reflecting on this Sustainable Development Goal and the lessons learnt in terms of urban design before, during and after lockdown experiences. So I want to begin just with some prompts that came from a visit I made to Portland, Oregon about 11 or 12 years ago. That often I think places of comparison can really have a considerable nudge in our thinking. And this is what happened when I was in Portland. Three things I saw. I want to give you three images. The first is this street scene. And in the street scene, we can see four modes of transportation. Cars restricted to one lane on the left. In the middle of the slide, we have buses and streetcars or light rail occupying the same lane. And then on the right, we have a pedestrian way, which is distinguished by being very wide, punctuated by trees and places to sit and notice boards and other amenities. So it seems to me that this says to us that cars are not dominating, that there are other forms of transportation, and pedestrians are getting a very wide space of the city. The second image from Portland is on the right here, and that's the bridge over the Willamette River. And what really struck me here is the way that cyclists are welcome on this bridge, and there is no fixed large barrier between cyclists and the motor vehicles. Now, admittedly, this is not a bridge that has the high traffic volumes of Auckland Harbour Bridge shown on the left, but Auckland Harbour Bridge represents an incredible lost opportunity from my perspective. When it was built 50 years ago, there were plans to have rail and pedestrian ways, but for the sake of cost saving, these were removed and it became an automobile-only a bridge, including buses, of course. But it has arguably led to more congestion because of that. The third image from Portland is outside City Hall, where, as you can see, the ceremonial bell around it is a vegetable garden installed for a homeless initiative. Now, clearly, that's not going to feed a large number of people, but symbolically, I think it's very important because it says that this is a shared space, and the act of working together on this vegetable garden helps build social inclusion. So, taking these observations from Portland, Oregon, it was very evident to me how we have some serious challenges here in Auckland, and you may well have very similar challenges in Edmonton, Alberta. When I spoke about Portland in a stage one lecture, a student whose name I can't remember, it was a few years ago now, sent me this picture from the shared house that she occupied with a number of roommates, saying that this is part of the problem. We live with four others, and we have 5 cars in this household, and that really contributes to congestion in the city. It collectively it reduces the impetus to walk and use public transit, that the routes were basically too far away. So to return to the Sustainable Development Goal number 11, which is to make cities inclusive, safe, reliant, and sustainable, it seems to me that we need to think about not just physical infrastructure. We need to think about homes and not just housing. We need to think about spaces where people can genuinely belong. And we need to think about, in terms of transportation, low carbon forms of transportation that can contribute to healthy environments, both locally but also in a planetary sense. So these sorts of inclusive, safe, resilient, sustainable initiatives speak to the need for not just material infrastructure, but also less visible forms of infrastructure that perhaps lead us into the less tangible forms of urban living. And this leads me to think about an old but very helpful tool, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that comes to us from social psychology. Maslow said that we have basic physiological needs at a sort of a foundational level in our lives. That's the sort of the shelter and the need for food, and these needs, once they're met, can lead us into addressing higher order needs such as safety and social needs. And at the apex of the pyramid, we have self-actualization, which is basically finding our place to belong in the city. So to look at a couple of research examples that build on this idea of there being an importance for soft or less visible social infrastructure, I want to talk about two examples in the condition of brevity that we have in this talk. So the first comes from a work on a housing development in the southern part of Auckland called Waimahia Inlet, and this was developed by an NGO, a non-government organisation that sought development partners to try and establish housing that was much more affordable and mixed tenure for those who are in need of housing. So in our evaluation of this housing development, what became readily apparent is that because the developers had presented new residents with a package of ways to have a feeling of belonging, including membership of a community Facebook platform, these new residents had an additional sense of belonging. They were connected to others who they hadn't perhaps even met. They were sharing surplus goods. They were exchanging tools through this idea of what we called Facebook as soft infrastructure. So there's one example of the way that a more sustainable community can be seeded, if you like, through invisible and soft infrastructure. The second example comes from my colleague Damien Collins at the University of Alberta. I thought I'd include one example with an Alberta colleague, and for many years, Damien Collins was based in New Zealand, and then after the move to Alberta, continued to work with me on this initiative of walking school buses. This is the idea that children are encouraged to walk to and from school, accompanied by I guess chaperoned by volunteer parents, and the idea is that it reduces the need for parents to take their kids to school every day themselves, whether walking, but more commonly by driving them to school, and so contributing to congestion in the neighbourhood. Now, just very briefly, I want to give an example of what one parent said about the walking school bus. This was a father, like I was at the time. I had my own kids on a walking school bus, and there's in this assessment that came from actually walking the route with him, this guy said there are great benefits, lots of intangible benefits over and above the obvious. It knits together the social fabric of your immediate neighbourhood. They get to know other kids' parents. It's great for the parents as well. Now, what I find significant here was a Kiwi father talking about knitting. I think that's really great, and yet using that metaphor helps us identify the way that there is an invisible sort of binding of the fabric of the community, and it speaks to a sort of a way that physical infrastructure such as sidewalks and roads can be generative of trust and connectedness and social capital if we can find ways for people to find a sense of belonging and connection on those routeways. So these sorts of types of research have methodological imperatives. And just to continue with the idea of working with kids in school communities, this is an example of using an approach called photo voice, where the idea is that you give people either disposable cameras or digital cameras, or maybe ask them to use their own phones to take pictures in the community of what's significant to them, and then print these up and generate discussion. So here we have two kids who took pictures within the community and came back, and we put the pictures up on posters, and they've been writing about what it means to them. And so these get beyond the somewhat confrontational survey questions of what do you think about this or that, or rating scales, and it allows people to be creative and give voice to how they feel, but through the visual. So I'd like to turn now in the second part of the talk to the pandemic that we're immersed in, whether it be in Alberta or New Zealand. So the pandemic, whichever way we look at it, is an epoch-defining break in time and space that holds profound anxiety, and yet it seems to me it also holds potential. Just two images here, one of our Prime Minister and the daily press briefings during the early part of the pandemic that came through Facebook itself, and also on the right a travel agency in a local mall that very quickly closed its doors and simply there was no business. The pandemic really led to profound changes in borders and distances across the world. And just to personalize it a bit, on the left we have an image of my son who returned from London in August and had to spend 14 days in managed isolation behind a fence like that, and all I could do was take a big box of groceries out to him to supplement the hotel food. And then upon release, along with him, finding that parks and walkways take on a new significance in terms of having a break from the lockdown experience. So what does all this say about the importance of soft infrastructure? Well, when we look at the image here of Queen Street on the left, this is the main retailing street in central Auckland. What the city authorities did was extend the sidewalk area out into the road, and that's demarcated by that pink line. And while potentially a temporary measure, what it actually does is suggest that pedestrians perhaps have at least the potential to have more of a place within the city than they did otherwise, a scaling back of the auto dominance of the city. So I think if we can begin to think about physical distancing as an opportunity to perhaps have more social connections and actually, I suppose, reclaim the streets, then we can perhaps see an opportunity within the necessary physical distancing of the pandemic. I'd like to begin to end with a piece of sort of, I guess, poetry it is almost, that I saw posted in the Auckland train station that speaks to me about the hyperlocal experience of neighbourhood that we've experienced and regained through the lockdown experience and the epidemic. So just to read this, because the print is rather small and I can't give credit to anyone because there was no author mentioned on this poster. In lockdown, we became different. We walked, we rode bikes, we saw things, we discovered our community, ourselves. We found a stream, a path, a street. We connected with each other, our neighbours. We heard quiet and birds and children's laughter. The sky was clearer, a new kind of normal. Imagine taking some of that good into our future. Let's go there. So this suggests some positive valences that could come from the pandemic in rethinking the importance of neighbourhoods, importance of the local, thinking through what a less auto-dominated city might be like. And so to wrap things up, let's return to the Sustainable Development Goal number 11 and just highlight the way that perhaps it says that we need to have a greater commitment, a recommitment to the local, within, of course, an ongoing awareness of the global. And this seems to me to speak to a need for attentiveness to both the big picture of urban design and urban planning, reflected in this aerial photograph on the left, but also the micro scale of details such as this symbolized by this children's playground, a picture I took in Toronto. And I did feel kind of sad for these kids surrounded by so much concrete, but there was at least a space for them, even though it was a very colourful space fenced in like this. So to end, I do feel this is something of a road less travelled for us in the Western world, that at least in our lifetimes we haven't been required or haven't been prompted to think about the local quite in such a profound way as this. And children in my neighbourhood had painted kia kaha, which means strong, be strong in Māori on one of the roads here. And I'd like to close with a whakataki, which is a Māori proverb. He aha te mea, nui o te ao, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata, which in English means, what is the most important thing? It is the people, the people, the people. So thank you, and I look forward to seeing the other presentations in this series.